Asif, and I'm very glad to be here. I'll just dive straight in. My talk is about a long-term project that I've been developing on the emergence of popular sovereignty and ideas of elective monarchy in early modern Iran, and in early modern political thought and political culture. It grows out of my upcoming book on imperial identity and state formation in 18th century Iran, where I argue that the collapse of the long-reigning Safavid dynasty led to fundamentally new ideas and structures in Iran's political culture. The collapse of the Safavids led the Shi'i elites in the country to formulate new notions of collective belonging as Iranians, supposedly sharing cultural and religious characteristics, as well as a deep sense of territorial belonging to Iran as a sacred Shia space. This was the first time since the fall of the Sasanian dynasty in late antiquity that we see the emergence of a distinct Iranian political identity, and one which served as the ideological foundation for the state, or rather the numerous states which emerged after the collapse of the Safavids in 1722. It was a collective, though not national, identity. And by this I mean that it's really only the elites that are speaking about belonging to this collective Iranian self. As far as we know, the overwhelming majority of the population, who are illiterate and peasants, we don't see any evidence, at least, for them partaking in and seeing themselves as Iranians. To what extent this identity penetrated into the overwhelming majority of the population, it just remains unknowable. My guess is not that much. Identities for these people remain largely local. Furthermore, Iranian identity in this period, unlike in the nationalist era, was not Persian-centric in either ethnic or linguistic terms. It was definitely multilingual. Some of the strongest affirmations of Iranian identity were made in Arabic or Turkic or even Kurdish, as well as Persian. This identity was not monolithic either, and different factions across the country had different inflections in order to justify and legitimate their own version of what will be referred to as the Iranian state, Dawlat-e-Iran. My upcoming book is really about the different manifestations of this imperial state, Dawlat-e-Iran, in the decades after the Safavid collapse, as I explain its changing ideological and institutional structures. One thing I mention in passing in my work, but don't develop fully, is the emergence of a curious discourse on elective monarchy. The rulers of these new so-called Iranian states were not uncommonly referred to as being elected to imperial sovereignty by unanimous consensus, the unanimous consensus of Ma-Ahl Iran, we the people of Iran. Several of the texts I consulted for the book elaborated a new understanding of the role of the people in political affairs, and it seems that sovereignty was no longer thought to be merely divinely ordained, but to require a mandate granted by the people. This unprecedented development in Iranian political thought forms the topic of my talk today. So the academic discourse on popular sovereignty is undoubtedly a Eurocentric one. The assumption is that our current notions of popular sovereignty, even of statehood more broadly, owe their origins to developments in the early modern West. They are rooted in Enlightenment philosophy and are exemplified by the revolutions in France and in America at the end of the 18th century. It was only later in the colonial era, with the unequal encounter of the West with the rest, that you see the adoption and adaptation of these notions of popular sovereignty and statehood by non-Western powers and non-Western states. Supposedly, this is the case. This view sits within a broader intellectual framework which goes back to 19th century European thought, and one thinker in particular, Hegel. Hegel argued that history was a purposeful progress by mankind as he strives for gaining greater consciousness of freedom and virtue. This teleological view of history marked out the West as the civilization, as the leader of this progress. Pushing forward through reason, overcoming the dogmatism and obscurantism of the past, usually associated with the Orient. The two most influential ideologies of the modern West are heavily influenced by this understanding of history. In Marxism, you have the idea of the progress of history, material conditions being the bedrock of Marxist understanding, and the dialectical relationship, the struggle between the two classes. As well as in liberalism, you have the march forward towards liberal democracies, powered by free markets. As Francis Fukuyama has it, the transformation into a liberal democracy is the end of history. It is the culminating point of our species development. We have a model which marks the end point of that human development. We're all moving towards it, or we ought to be moving towards it. And of course, one of the most widely accepted values in the modern world, especially the West, is the notion of popular sovereignty. And this represents also, the closer we get to progress, the more we progress, the more democratic we become, the more we embody and think of politics as only justified through the lens of popular sovereignty. Sovereignty lies with the people in general. The idea of progress in history has been very pervasive in not just the West, but across much of the world. There is something which seems convincing about it, that human society, as it develops ever more sophisticated and powerful technologies, should also experience a parallel development in the moral sphere. But of course, this is meaningless. What basis are we going to use to gauge moral progress exactly? The idea of a teleological course in human history strikes us today as naive. Why should human society necessarily be on the course to realize a final perfect state of being, the culminating point of a development? What evidence really is there for this? What most historians assume now is that we don't see a teleological progress at all. There is no end state in history. What we actually see is a constant non-teleological change. In other words, history is not leading anywhere in particular. And the West is not the natural leader of any progress to begin with. It is one actor amongst many, and it has played a very important part in scientific progress, the development of more powerful and sophisticated technologies, surely, but we shouldn't always assume that all of these ideas on, for example, popular sovereignty, also exclusively originate in the West and Western philosophy. So we see some scholarship emerging which challenges this kind of thinking. There is a new and exciting development amongst historians which posits that notions of popular power and sovereignty emerged in several early modern Islamic societies, rooted in a different intellectual tradition than that of the European Enlightenment. One of my favorite works here on the left is Baki Tezcan's The Second Ottoman Empire. He argues that the absolute power of the Ottoman Sultan was curbed in the 17th century through an alliance of the ulema and a burgeoning Ottoman mercantile urban class as embodied by the Janissaries, who were increasingly a corporate body rather than a military force. The Sharia provided the legal framework for the deposition and even execution of overbearing sultans who disregarded the social and economic interests of the new and burgeoning elites in the urban centers of the Ottoman Empire. So my current research is aligned with this new trajectory in academia. And I argue that we see unprecedented changes in 18th century Iranian political thought and culture, which re-envisioned the relationship between the people and kingly sovereignty. It was no longer sufficient to claim a divinely ordained hereditary claim to power. One had to also convincingly demonstrate that there was a popular mandate for one to rule. a popular mandate granted by the Ahl-e-Iran, the people of Iran. Of course, much like anywhere else in the modern world, early modern world, the people who were genuinely consulted and who supposedly represented the wider people were an emergent and expanding class of elites. Now I'll give you some historical background so we can situate ourselves in the 18th century Iranian world and see where this is going. The Safavid dynasty, which had come to power over 2 centuries ago, had successfully overseen a mass conversion of the population to Shi'i Islam. Not everyone in the empire was, of course, Shi'i, but certainly a majority were by this time. Naturally, many of the political, military, economic, and religious elites were also Shi'i. Despite its remarkable endurance, the Safavid Empire, after over 2 centuries, began disintegrating in the early 18th century. The reason for this is not simple. There are a myriad reasons, including environmental, the decline of silk as the main export of the country, and very importantly, I think, the growth of a powerful network of imperial and provincial elites that checked and curbed the power of the center and the center's administration. The bankrupt treasury could not support an effective standing army, and the numerous rebellions against Safavid authority in the margins of the empire went unchecked. The most pressing among these was the rebellion of the Afghans of Kandahar. They began raiding into central Iran, finding the capital to be vulnerable, and they besieged it. After a 6-month siege, the Safavid Shah led his courtiers in a disgraceful audience with the Afghan chieftain outside the city walls. He handed over his crown and his imperial aigrettes. This signals the end of the Safavid dynasty, or so one would think. They actually keep coming back and keep getting demolished and dispersed and keep coming back all throughout the 18th century in different forms. The rule of a Sunni Afghan sovereign was unpalatable for the overwhelming majority of the provincial elites, and no pledges of loyalty were forthcoming from the periphery. Even the villages and hamlets around Isfahan had to be conquered by brute force. And the Afghans start to carve out, through military conquest, almost exclusively military conquest, this central kingdom that you see in Iran. They lie at Tatat, the imperial capital, and they claim to be Shahs of Iran, but actually much of the former Safavid Empire is beyond their control. In fact, the largest part is grabbed by the Ottomans here in the west, who take pretty much most of the South Caucasus, Azerbaijan, the west of Iran, even down to Ahvaz. And in the north, you see the littoral of the Caspian Sea, which is taken by the Russians, who managed to use this opportunity to come further down south in what Peter the Great thinks will be eventually a land bridge to India. But they never really make it beyond the Caspian littoral. And the rest of the country just disintegrates into chaos. Most of them are local rulers or various claimants to the throne, trying to establish their own imperial dynasty. The widespread war and occupation by non-Shi'i powers was devastating to the country. The Hotagid family, a former client from the periphery, had established a Sunni Afghan dynasty on the throne of Iran. Large tracts of land were annexed by the Ottomans, the historic foe to the west, while upstart Russians, held in very low regard by early modern Iranians, had seized on the chaos to make annexations of their own. In my book, I describe how the elite's traumatic fall from the privileged position formed the background to new discourses on Iranian identity, which emphasized a collective sense of territorial belonging to Iran as a sacred Shia space. And the collective Iranian self was put in a hostile relationship with the non-Iranian, non-Shi'i, usually Sunni other. So the Afghans were the prime other in this period, and later, as the Afghans are vanquished, it becomes the Ottomans that are the prime Sunni other that needs to be expunged from the sacred space and territory of Iran. There were widespread calls for a resurgence of Iran's Shi'i and the ouster of all foreign, sometimes referred to as Khariji, enemies. Of course, Khariji has a double meaning here. Khariji means outsider, quite literally, but also it refers to the Khawarij, a group of people who abandoned the first Imam, the first Shia Imam, Ali, and who waged war against him. So here you see there's kind of an allusion to the non-Shi'i identity of the other. They're purposely making use of the term Khariji to refer to a profane as well as a territorially an outside force. There were efforts, therefore, to re-establish Iranian Shi'i sovereignty in the realm, but there was definitely no consensus on what form this would take and who should lead the way forward. There were those who wished for a return to the Safavid dynastic rule, as had been the case prior to 1722. Others wished to see a Safavid restoration, but under completely new conditions, while many rejected the Safavids altogether and called for an apocalyptic savior to be sent forth by the Imams, and others seized the opportunity to nominate themselves as the new Shahs of Iran. So everyone is kind of taking part in this new discourse on Iranian identity and trying to use various inflections of it, inflecting it in a manner to justify and legitimate their own material interests, their own claims to power. This is something new, and really the purpose of my upcoming book with Edinburgh University Press is to argue that there is real evidence for the emergence of a distinct political Iranian identity in this period, and furthermore that it's at the very heart of political discussion and political thought. Up to now, I think most historians would say Iran and the idea of Iran serves more as a poetic and literary reality in the minds of pre-modern people. And really, a distinct political Iranian identity is only something that is realized in the early 20th century with the establishment of a strong nation state with a national curriculum, a map. And I largely agree that nation states are, of course, a 20th century thing. But there is a distinct imperial collective Iranian identity that we see in the early modern period. And there are many contrasts with the national version of this identity, yet it is absolutely crucial in the political life, culture, and the events and developments, politically, militarily, culturally, philosophically, of this region. So there is a search for a savior who is going to restore the Iranian Shia and to expel the Afghans. The Mokafatnameh is written by a former Safavid official who is imprisoned by the Afghans, and during his imprisonment he writes a book of poetry. And in it he's essentially asking for the abandonment of the Safavids and the emergence of a new millenarian savior. Bequeath the throne to one of your own household, one Sahabi. Seize upon it one endowed with wisdom. Vanquish each and every evil oppression. Let the clouds of your mercy rain upon Iran. So here you have the connection of Iran as a sacred imperial space with the Imams themselves. It is the Imams themselves that are going to send forth or come forth as the divinely ordained saviors of the empire. In Nadim's Divan, Nadim was a poet and court official in a small Khorasani local court in the northeast of Iran. And after the Afghan invasions, he's very perturbed by this, and he makes a pilgrimage to the shrine of Imam Ali in southern Iraq. And while he's there, he writes his divan of poetry. And it's full of millenarian angst and calls to expunge the Afghans and Sunni others from Iranian dominions. It is clear from the tumult of the age that there is nothing for me in this Safavid dynasty. I was retainer to the Shahs of the age. Alas, I cannot accept any state other than that of the master of time, Sahib Sah. referring to the 12th Imam, who is thought to be in occultation, and here Nadim is hoping that he will come out of occultation in order to save and lift the shame of the Iranian Shia. He shall answer the call of the captives in Iran, the master Sahib of Iran. Here you have almost sovereignty associated with the imams themselves, rather than associated with anyone acting on their behalf. The Shah of Justice, that commander of the faithful, referring to Ali. And it's in this context that most of these generals and military leaders, clan leaders, are trying to vie with one another and identify themselves as, I am the divinely ordained savior. I was sent by Ali. And all of them are making similar claims. Here you have a person who comes from a relatively humble background, a local chieftain by the name of Malik Mahmud from Khorasan on the frontier to the northeast. And he establishes a very small fiefdom in Khorasan and begins to commission various works of art and poetry which identify him as the Iranian savior. And a lot of his peers are making reference to the Iranian people and how they are the ones who are supported unanimously, supposedly, by that people. Mm-hmm. There can be no more opportune a moment than this for me to bring Iran under my dominion. As I am descended from the Khayanate Shahs, the Iranians are beholden to me since ages past. And as I am a Shi, they will in sincerity all come together in my support. There is an anxiety about claiming support amongst the Iranian people, and it's inflected with Shi identity, and also here you have reference to the legendary dynasty of the Khayanids from the Shahnameh. And here you have a Safavid prince who manages to slip past the encirclement of Isfahan during the siege, and he unsuccessfully campaigns to raise an army in order to lift the siege. In the years after the fall of Isfahan, he's constantly being harassed by various Ottoman and Russian armies, and he's trying to build up a force. He's trying to build up and restore his dynasty. When he goes to the north, he's chased away from the west by the Ottomans, chased away from the north by the Russians, and he has nowhere else to go but Khorasan. And he writes a letter to the local nobility in which he says, presently the people of Iran have been assailed from every quarter, and day by day the enemies grow stronger around us. Again, the sense of being territorially enclosed, the outsider having come in and breached to the interior. For many centuries, the people of Iran have transfixed their loyal gaze upon the threshold of our exalted Safavid dynasty. So, despite the early Safavids having no real notion of an Iranian people or really an Iranian realm until really well into Tahmasp I's reign, 30 or 40 years after establishing the dynasty, what you have here is a revision of the past, saying that, of course, we have always been supported by the Iranian people, and the Iranian people are still all loyal to this dynasty and this dynasty alone. May God Almighty show the Shia of Ali kindness. And you can see here that Iranian and Shia are almost interchangeable. They're almost synonymized in this context, enabling us to regain the dominions of Iran and to take the fight into foreign lands. It's apparent that the political and military elites who engaged in this new discourse on collective identity felt the need to articulate their mission as being for the sake of the Iranian people and the Iranian realm, to whom they belonged and who were beholden to them, frequently making allusion to popular support for their dynasty, real or mythical. In the case of Mahmud, he spoke of this mythical Khayanid lineage that had always served Iranian interests, and then with Tahmasp, you have this, but with the real and actual dynasty of his forebears, the Safavids. So we talked about military leaders and clan leaders. We're going to talk about someone who's quite different and is probably my favorite character from the 18th century. When I was a young kid, I really used to idolize the conqueror Nader Shah. I think he's the equivalent in Iranian political thought and culture of Napoleon. So if you're a 10-year-old boy, you constantly gravitate towards this very bombastic and dramatic figure. But now that I'm an academic, I think I should choose someone more sensible. So I've chosen this Sufi philosopher. Sayyid Qutbuddin Muhammad Nerizi was the 32nd head of the Zahabiya Sufi order. It was one of the most popular and influential Shi'i Sufi orders in the Safavid period, with followers across almost all Iran's dominions and regions. Nerizi was born in a family of Sufis in Fars, but later settled in Isfahan. He was a witness to the Afghan siege and occupation of Isfahan. The trauma of the Afghan invasion prompted Nerizi to pen several works in an effort to explain the Safavids' collapse and to offer a way forward to restoring Shia sovereignty. While his earlier works called for a Safavid restoration, subject to various caveats, Nerizi later turned against the Safavid cause, accusing the dynasty of having betrayed Iranian Shiism, al-Shi'at al-Iraniya, as he put it, and he mostly wrote in Arabic, as I'll describe. Similar to his contemporaries, Nerizi incorporated notions of Iran and Iranian identity in his discourse on forming a legitimate state. As a Sufi, Nerizi felt estranged from the Safavid state. From the second half of the 17th century, Sufi beliefs and practices were shunned by the Safavid court and its allies among the juristically minded ulama. The latter condemned the popular Sufism of the wandering dervishes, as well as the more highbrow Sufism of philosophers and mystics. Both varieties of Sufism were accused of spreading moral corruption, pantheism, sexual vice, and superstition. The juristic ulama went so far as to argue Sufism was a threat to Shia and even Iranian identity later in the early 18th century, and equated it even with Sunnism. That's the ultimate way of otherizing Sufism. The rising anxiety of the juristic ulama indicates the growing popularity of Sufism amongst the laymen in the late Safavid period. But while Sufism was popular and attracted followers in wider society, Sufis saw their access to power, and especially political power, being restricted by the court and the clerical establishment. Opportunities and privileges were taken away from Sufis as they found themselves unwelcome at court and unable to access higher posts in the Safavid state. Even though Sufis were once at the heart of political power in Safavid Iran, by Nerizi's time, they had lost much of their political influence to the juristic ulama. And here you see this reflected in Nerizi's letters. Pretty much everything that I've read from him is in Arabic, very eloquent and elegant classical Arabic. He wrote to the Shaykh al-Islam of the Safavids in the 1720s after the Afghans had occupied central Iran, and he claimed to be authoring all of these works to preserve and strengthen our religion, our state, our realm, and our religious community. And who is this us? Again and again, throughout his letters, he refers to the Ahl al-Iran, the Iranian people. And these people are supposed to have been coalescing around Dinana, our faith, wa dawlatana, our state, mulkuna, our realm, wa millatana, our religious community, our community of believers. In his Divan of Poetry, also composed in Arabic, he claims that my endeavor is to reclaim our lands, biladana, and the order of our religion, dinana, so that God in his majesty may preserve the honor of our religious community, millatana, from the enemy, to be safeguarded in our realm, mulkana, from here on out until this sedition, fitna, ends. The fitna referring to the occupation of Iran by foreign Sunni powers. This is my goal in writing this treatise, to save the self, al-nafs, from the hellfire that is the enemy. Nerizi's Sufi grievances were woven into his explanations for why the realm had been thrown into chaos and how he and his fellow ulama, both Sufis and jurists, might save it from ruin. His Tibb al-Mamalik, which means medicine for the empire, was a treatise written during the early to mid-1720s, purporting to diagnose the realm's ailments and prescribe remedies. The fact that the Tib, along with most of Nayrizi's works, were composed in Arabic suggests that he was writing with the religious classes in mind. Arabic had an influential place in Iran's intellectual discourses going back to the medieval period. There was renewed emphasis on Arabic as the language of religious authority and learning in the Safavid period. The erudite use of Arabic, of course, displayed intellectual competence among fellow ulama. Arabic grammar and syntax were key parts of the curriculum in madrasas, where it was emphasized that religious knowledge could only be gained based on the correct use and understanding of Arabic. At a time when many among the clerical establishment viewed Sufis to be misled, even heretical, Nayrizi's use of eloquent Arabic was perhaps meant to bolster his credibility and that of his works among his juristically minded peers. The intended audience for the Tib was both the ulama and the wider public, it seems, because O ulama, ya ayyuhal ulama, and ya ayyuhan nas, O people, are both referenced throughout the work. Although given the fact that the public was overwhelmingly illiterate, the treatise was primarily aimed at the ulama, who would be well versed in the classical Arabic of the Tib. The Tib focused on the proximity of the juristic ulama to the Safavid rulers and how this had made both corrupt, distancing the ruling elite from true Shia Islam. The Tib did not grant any agency to the Afghan conquerors in explaining the Safavids' collapse, stating that, quote, the ruin of the realm is not fundamentally due to the triumph of the enemy. For Nayrizi, it was the negligence of the Shah, someone who he refers to as that cowardly oppressor, corrupt negator of the tradition of the Prophet. And he also chalks it up to the fiscal corruption among his nobles, and above all, of course, the moral corruption of the juristically minded and Sufi persecuting Safavid ulama allied with the Safavid establishment. Informed by various pronouncements from the Quran and Shi'i compilations of Hadith, there is a strong disdain for monarchic power, and it is viewed almost as a necessary evil. The Tib expressed Nayrizi's resentment of the Shahs and their allied ulama who had shunned Sufi ulama like him. In contrast to the corrupt ulama's obedience to the Sultan, Nayrizi suggested, quote, the cure to this disastrous situation is obedience to the word of Ali. Nayrizi was calling for Alid authority and loyalty among his class. Naturally, the Tib's analyses and arguments were predominantly based on Alid sermons, the teachings of the first Imam. The single most important source, in fact, for the treatise was the Nahj al-Balagha, which is Arabic for the way of eloquence. It's a compilation of hadiths and sayings supposedly uttered by the first Imam, Ali. The Tib then put forth a practical roadmap for a return to a Shi'i state through a Safavid restoration, led and sanctioned by a unified class of ulama, and this is before he turns against the Safavids. The ulama were called upon to elect a scion from the surviving members of the dynasty and give him their unified support. In the Tib, Nayrizi cites a hadith. For every difficult affair, there is a qur'a. What is a qur'a? Qur'a being the Arabic for drawing lots, but it seems to be used here in the sense of election, as is made clear from his subsequent demand, quote, you, he's referring to the ulama when he says you, must come together and qur'a. I think he means elect. Elect to form a unanimous consensus rising one of the Safavids to the position of sultanship. He then continues to outline how a document should be drawn up on the basis of the Nahj al-Balagha, the compilation of Alid hadiths and narratives, on the basis of the Nahj al-Balagha, which will provide the ordinance of the realm, including, he says, and quote, collecting tribute, organizing the fight against the enemies, and attending to the flourishment of the provinces. You must gain from the Shah a mithaq, which is kind of like an oath in Arabic. But he's clearly talking about a written oath. he's talking about a treaty to be drawn up, which will govern according to the order, dastur, of Imam Ali on matters such as the caliphate, emirate, governing of the provinces, how to deal with its inhabitants, how to organize them into guilds and groups as is necessary, which include the sacred army. These are the different groups that will be governed according to this Alid kind of constitution. The sacred army, the scribes, the bureaucrats who deal with letters, both public and private, and the officials of the judiciary and magistrates who dispense justice, the affairs of the dhimmis and those who pay the jizya tax, as well as the taxes of all the Muslim peoples, the merchants, the guildsmen and artisans, the classes of the poor and the dervishes and those who are in need, and also how to organize the tax officials, how to form advisory councils, how to administer the army, how to engage in espionage. All these affairs are included also. These should be organized as laid down in the Nahj al-Balagha. He finishes, it is necessary on the basis of this treaty, so it really is talking about a written document, mu'ahida as he calls it, a written kind of agreement, to draft a document, kitaban, binding him, he's talking about the Shah that they will elect, us, he's talking about the ulama, and the ru'aya. He's talking about, ru'aya is usually translated as subjects, but I have my own reasons for translating it differently. I translate it as just people, the people, and the people, and to dispatch this to all the provinces of the empire. So he's going to send copies to every single province of Iran. Thus, the people were not to be merely subject to the constitution, but participants in it, signatories to it. Although the ulama were placed in a privileged position over the people were nonetheless involved as participants. Furthermore, the manner of its description makes quite clear that the treaty which Nader had in mind was a constitution. It's not just a consultative form of government where he's loosely laying out the king should consult us whenever he wants to make an important decision. He's talking about we need a document which prescribes in great detail what is going to happen militarily, politically, in terms of espionage, all of these policies. So what Nader had in mind was a constitution which would be sent out to the provinces of the empire to regulate the military, economic, social, ecclesiastical, and administrative order, dastur, of the Mamalik, the empire as a whole. Nader's Tibb al-Mamalik is truly an innovative political treatise. Although his calls were not taken up by the majority of the ulama and his vision of a new political order in Iran governed by an Alid constitution never came to pass, his ideas were unprecedented. His ideas were informed by the growing abstraction of the state from the dynasty and its interests. Indeed, he closes by saying that the people will not oppose us if we all congregated to draft this treaty and fatwa, and if we all sealed it together. God willing, none will oppose what the commander of the faithful, Ali, has ordained on the, and this is the very interesting part, the interests of the realm and community. Maslahat al-mulk wal-millah, and the maslahat of the deen wa dawla, and the interest of the faith and of the state. The interest of the state. Encoded in this was the idea that political loyalties were not just to persons and dynasties, but also to the state and to the realm. The notion of maslahat al-dawlat in Persian would be maslahat al-dawlat, the interest of the state, made it conceivable for the first time to accuse a Shah of treason, and this is exactly what happened later in the late 1720s. Previously, this was not possible. After all, treason against what and who? If the state, the Dawla, as it had been for centuries, was very much identified with the dynast, then how could the dynast engage in treason? How could he betray himself? It is the separation of these two which allows for this distinction. It makes it conceivable that, yes, a king can actually engage in treason against the state, and we have to we have to keep the interests of the state in mind. It was precisely these kinds of developments in political thought and culture that Nader, an upstart general, would use to accuse Tahmasp of treason and have him deposed. Nader was from a very humble background, a petty margrave on the Khorasanian frontier in the northeast. But when a Safavid claimant, Tahmasp, the prince who escaped the siege, fled to Khorasan, Nader's charisma made quite an impression on the fugitive prince, and eventually Nader became his general and foremost vassal. He brought Khorasan under heel and fashioned a new and powerful army armed with flintlock muskets and cannon, thoroughly drilled and instilled with an iron discipline. He was able to not only defeat the Afghans and place Tahmasp on his ancestral throne, he marched west and ousted the Ottomans from western Iran. He managed in large part to restore the Safavid dynasty before going along and destroying it himself. A new rebellion by the Afghans drew Nader east, and this is when Tahmasp, in an effort to establish and reassert his own power and come out of the shadow of Nader, embarked on a new campaign against the Ottomans. This was a terrible mistake, because the Ottomans dealt Tahmasp a heavy defeat and made a new peace treaty under which all of the lands recovered previously by Nader in his campaigns were given back to the Ottomans to annex. Nader began writing letters to all the governors and provincial leaders across the realm, calling on them to reject the ignominious peace in the interests of the state. Maslahat din o dawlat. Accusations of incompetence and even treason were leveled against Tahmasp, and at an assembly of notables called by Nader to consider the issue, Tahmasp was deposed in favor of his infant son. Nader became regent and de facto ruler of the state. After defeating the Ottomans in a series of astonishing campaigns, Nader had successfully restored the frontiers of the empire, regaining all the lands lost since the Safavid collapse in 1722. And that's when he called a Qurultai, a grand assembly of Iran's notables. What is a Qurultai? I think this is the point at which I should discuss some of the Turco-Mongol traditions that formed the background, intellectual and cultural background, to the emergence of these ideas of popular sovereignty. The Turkic and Mongol dynasties which came to, of course, before I do this, I would just like to say this is perhaps one of my favorite paintings in the 18th century. Because here you have Nader, and you can see the Khorasanians, who are referred to by the Safavid court as hat wearers. And you can see on horseback Tahmasp. And of course, he's not dismounting. It's a clear vassal-ruler relationship, and Nader is just lovingly taking him in his embrace. It's one of the most colorful and beautiful and really unique paintings in, I think, the 18th century. But I'm not an art historian, so I won't say anything other than I think it looks very beautiful. So the Turkic and Mongol dynasties, which came to rule Iran for much of its medieval and early modern history, had their origins in the steppe, and even long after settling in the Iranian plateau, retained the clan structures and autonomous nature of their political organization, which is characteristic of the steppe. Rather than an elaborate administrative hierarchy, which administers and taxes easily countable and stationary assets, the nomads of the steppe were mobile, and their assets in constant flux. This made an elaborate and permanent administration very difficult. It meant that the imperial ruler, the great Khan or Khaqan, would necessarily have to rule in a decentralized manner, with a light touch, so to speak. The steppe nobility were also quite accustomed to a high degree of autonomy. They did not take kindly from any official from the center poking around their fiefdoms and appanages. This meant that the ruler had to cultivate relatively close relationships with the notables of his nomadic empire and to respect their autonomy. Turco-Mongol political culture regarded governance to be a collective patrimonial concern. The great Khan was expected to consult the nobility on important matters and to be generous in the division of war spoils. whether it be slaves, goods, or conquered lands. It was customary to hold a kongash, a Mongol term meaning meeting or council, where the nobility were gathered to kongash to discuss matters of consequence and allow for the nobility to be included in decision making. The most important form of such meeting was the kurultai, and kurultai means Grand Assembly. It's an assembly in which the nobility were gathered to confirm as a ruler usually the victor who had already won on the battlefield and needed to, in a ritualistic and ceremonial manner, show and demonstrate that he had the approval of the steppe nobility of the empire. And of course, these nobles would give a muchalcha, or an oath of loyalty to the ruler. In the Mongol period, it seems that this muchalcha, or this oath, was done orally and publicly in front of all the other grandees and notables. But as time went on, this tradition was made more formal and written muchalkas, and you have the Persian term muchalgeh, which comes from the original Mongol, of giving a written statement in which a nobleman would offer his fealty to the imperial sovereign. And so what you had is a kurultai in which the nobility would affirm the king and the imperial ruler, but in exchange, what would he be expected to do? To carve up the resources and the assets of his empire, and to mark each nobleman and each petty khan with his own appanage, his own privileges. Perhaps if the coffers were to be opened and various robes of honor were to be distributed, this would be another way to bind the nobility to the imperial sovereign. Thus far, there's no mention of the people. This is still very much the nobility and the imperial figurehead, right? In 1736, after conquering most of the lost territories and re-establishing the frontiers, Nader also calls a kurultai. And in this kurultai, you have, it depends. His own historians and secretaries say it's around 100,000 noblemen who are gathered all across from all across Iran. He himself, in the letters that he writes, claims that all the people of Iran were there, that's even more absurd. But others put it at a much more modest figure of 5 to 10,000, perhaps 20,000, but certainly no more than that. But nonetheless, a very significant gathering of notables. These are chancellery officials, generals, from all forms of elite walks of life. You have people being invited, even notable poets are invited and included in these discussions. And you have a Turco-Mongol ceremonial setting for which it is no longer, at least this is the language that is deployed, it is no longer the nobility, as the Mongols would have said, the akhanar and ininar, the elder brothers and the younger brothers of the noble class, who are choosing and electing the Khan or confirming him. It is we, the people of Iran. And in the Mochalcha, the written document, which is the coronation declaration essentially, you have a very explicit identification with the people of Iran. It's written, in fact, in the first person plural. We, the people of Iran, choose and elect Nader to be our king. So the role of the nobility is actually taken on, ideologically at least, by the people, the Ahl-e Iran. And these Turco-Mongol traditions and narratives are blended in with Sufi and Islamic ideas and frameworks. So you have in the official chronicles of Nader, as well as several of his own letters declaring his coronation to various magnates in the provinces, the use of Quranic passages and Arabic passages taken from the Hadiths, which seem to make reference to the people making a selection. Of course, these are horribly decontextualized from their original meanings, and they're couched in a very new ideological setting to frame Nader's election by the Iranian people. From the Surat al-Hud, you have, that is the day upon which the people al-Nas shall be gathered. That gives a Quranic kind of framing to the Qurultai, which is originally a Turco-Mongol kind of gathering and assembly. Then you have a hadith from the 6th Imam. The essence of the people, Baydat al-Ghawn, was revealed through this decision once they elect Nader to the kingship. And also, a lot of Sufi poetry, especially Persian poetry, from Hafiz and Hafiz's Diwans make an appearance in the chronicles. So you have things where the Pir Moghon, which is supposed to be the supreme spiritual guide in a lot of Sufi poetry, including in Hafiz's Diwan, identified with Nader. And the disciples who gravitate towards the Pir Moghon are the people of Iran. There's a homologous relationship. Just as the disciples of the Sufi order follow and love the Pir Moghon, their spiritual guide and sheikh, the people of Iran are following and in love with Nader and choose and elect his sovereignty over all else. So long as there is wine and there is a sign of the tappen, we are intoxicated, following in the steps of the Pir Moghon. How could we turn away from the threshold of the Pir Moghon? Fortune, and of course fortune is dolat, but it has a double meaning in this context. Fortune and enlightenment lie in his abode. And let's go to the Mochalcha, which every single grandee, we have different accounts of participants who partook in this, and we have a very interesting account by an Armenian Catholicos who wrote, Abraham of Crete, I think, Kertatsi. He wrote a detailed account of what he experienced in the Grand Assembly at the Qurultai. And of course, we still have the Mochalcha in Iran's National Museum in Tehran. So what does it say? What is the language like? After we had forsaken hope and the dust of hopelessness had settled upon the heads of all the people of Iran, then according to God's wisdom, comfort will be brought forth after hardship. Surat al-Talaq, verse 7. The Lord sent forth his appointed one, Nader, who dawned from Khorasan and scattered the darkness which had shrouded the fate of the oppressed. It gives an account of Nader's brilliant victories and how he restored Khak-e Iran, the soil of Iran, to sanctity by expelling the foreign Khariji enemy. And it continues, and the affairs of the realm were put in order, and all the people of the Iranian realm, whether Turk or Tajik, noble or common, elder or younger, wise or ignorant, great or small, were summoned here to the plain of Mohan. So the idea that every single Iranian is present, whether they're Turk or Tajik, commoner or noble, wise or ignorant, great or small, were summoned here to the plain of Mohan. And he asked them to appoint a man to the sultanship, either from the Safavid dynasty or from any other group we wish. It's written in the first person plural. This is supposed to be an attestation written by the Iranian people on who they elected. We, the people of Iran, concluded that we have suffered all that we have because of the fires of sedition stoked by the Safavid state, which forsook the frontiers to the enemy and abandoned us to our wretched fate. They proved unable to guard and secure us. We were only granted our liberty, Azad Kardeh, by that blessed Lord, Nader, who saved us from the clutches of the enemy, giving new life to our decrepit body. And this is, I think, where it all comes together, at least if you're looking for popular sovereignty as an idea. Thus, we all willingly, vocally, and unanimously elected him to the sultanship. The Persian word used is intikhab, select. And this is far from a unique document, actually, because, as we know, Nader is eventually assassinated, and a host of new claimants to the throne come to the fore. And in Khorasan, a lot of the same elites that partook in the Grand Assembly in 1736, which elected Nader, they find another Safavid, and they want to congregate around him and form a new Iranian state, a new Dawlat-e-Iran. And they invite a wide range of bureaucrats, guild members, artisans, and guilds from other cities outside of Mashhad to come to Mashhad, and they draft together another Mochalqa, another loyalty pact, in which you find the following. And they're rejecting, of course, the Naderid state that went before it. The purpose of drafting this treaty is as follows. Since the Afghans gained power over the dominion of Iran, and Sultan Hussein, that was the last Safavid Shah, was martyred, the Lord Nader Shah fought on behalf of Sultan Hussein's son, Tahmasp II, expunging the realm of Iran from their presence. Nader deposed Shah Tahmasp through guile and treason, himself seizing the control of the Sultanship of Iran. During his reign, he engaged in all manner of excess and oppression, sundering the clans from their old homelands and bringing ruination to the dominions of Iran. He stripped life, limb, wealth, honor, and dignity from the people, suffering under his extortionate levies and innumerable exactions. They were forced to sell their women and children as slaves to those of the opposite sect. So, the exact opposite of Nader's discourse on legitimacy, he's not the savior of the Iranian Shia. He is, in fact, the main oppressor of the Iranian Shia. He's the one who is engaging in treason. Thus, we accepted Nader's grandson as Shah, since his maternal lineage, at least, tied him to the Safavid dynasty, thinking that he may become edified, tarbiyat pazir, that he may come to possess discernment and wisdom, so that he may assuage the injuries visited upon the people and correct the sins of Nader Shah. Ultimately, however, it transpired that it became apparent to all and sundry that due to his young age, weakness, incompetence, ineloquence, and the lack of both talent and experience, that he could not take on such a task. We are approaching a state of affairs where the foundation of the state, Asas-e-Dawlat itself, may be altogether collapsed. And God forbid, this will invite our enemies to transgress against the lives, property, and honor of the people of God. So the people of honor and the people of God are identified with we, the people of Iran. And then, since Iran is still the subject of divine beneficence, God has shone his light upon Suleiman II of the Safavids, who is by inheritance and by merit, as judged by we, the people of Iran, on account of lineage and virtue, judged to be in all aspects worthy of kingship, and the people of Iran, after the end of Shah Tahmasp II's reign, have made repeated requests for him to take up the mantle of sultanship. So again, you have it framed as the people of Iran coming together and judging one to be worthy of being elected to sultanship and kingship. And so the mandate for sovereignty is both divine and popular. And you have the ongoing relevance of this kind of idea all across the 18th century, until the establishment of the Qajar states, with a lot of the Qajars revising and abandoning the innovations in political thought and culture that happened. Although I have not really delved into the early Qajar sources as thoroughly as Asif has, so I'm open to discussing to what extent these ideas and these trends in political thought and culture continued, and to what extent we see a discontinuity by the end of the 18th century and the establishment of the Qajar state. But it seems to me that the ideas on popular sovereignty, however, are definitely abandoned. But the idea of Dawlat-e-Iran is not, because the Qajars from the very beginning are thinking of themselves as, yes, this is the Dawlat-e-Iran. I think I went very much over time. And I'm not sure how much time we have for questions, but I'm very happy to take questions now.
Great, thank you.